Hey Jeremy, I have my history final coming up, and I don't know anything about World War I. Could you help me out?
Sure, Cuba. World War I was the biggest conflict to date, resulting in 9 million casualties.
That's interesting. But to what extent were these countries justified morally, politically, and economically in entering a war and rebuilding after the war?
Well, first, Cuba, we have to look at the four main causes of the war.
Jeremy, could you go into more depth on these?
Well, first, there's militarism, which helped cause a war since countries were already building armies. Second, there was alliances. When one country would attack the other, one of those countries had an alliance, and that alliance would jump in. There's a primary source below the main causes, which demonstrates England's role in entering the war because of an alliance with Belgium in a treaty that was signed in the late 1800s, so it had a lasting effect. Third is imperialism. This started war because countries were competing to gain new territory. And finally, nationalism, which our next teacher can explain further with the powder keg.
What did nationalism have to do with the crisis in the Balkans, and how did it lead to World War I?
Well, Thomas, in the Balkans, there was a country called Serbia, and above them was a country called Austria. Prior to World War I, Austria annexed Serbia. This means they took them over without asking. This deeply angered Russia, which would lead to them declaring war on Austria. This ties back to Jeremy's idea about ideas like nationalism and alliances. Ties back to nationalism because the people in Serbia were extreme nationalists. This means that they had a lot of pride in their country and therefore did not want Austrians taking over. This ties into alliances because Serbia had an alliance with Russia, and therefore, when Serbia was taken over by the Austrians, the Russians were obligated to then invade Austria. Nationalism in Serbia is best exemplified by my primary source to the right. This primary source shows a telegram from a member of the Serbian government. This telegram shows their extreme outrage of their annexation. This would lead to the start of the war. However, before the war started, there had to be an ignition point. The ignition point is expressed in my primary image to the left. This primary image shows the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by a Serbian rebel. This would be the ignition point that started World War I. These are all very interesting points, but how did the United States influence the end of the war?
Well, that's a good thing to bring up. The U.S. entrance into the war unbalanced the stalemate, which forced Germany to surrender the war.
But what did the U.S. do to influence the post-war period?
Well, Woodrow Wilson was one of the Big Four, as seen in the primary source to the left, for the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was the most important document for the post-war era, as seen in the primary source to the right. Woodrow Wilson made the 14 points and came up with the League of Nations.
Okay, Kevin, explain the 14 points.
The U.S. influenced the end of World War I under the creation of the 14 points by Woodrow Wilson. World War I has taken the lives of millions of soldiers and civilians in a war most people didn't even know why they were fighting in it. These points outlined a way to peace and were created to put an end to warfare in Europe. This led to an agreement that was later reached amongst the Allies, with the exception of the United States that wanted to stay isolated from European affairs. The 14 points aimed to end secret treaties, to create free seas, weaken military powers, fair treatment to colonies, create independent countries, change borders, self-determination, and create the League of Nations in Europe. The League of Nations acted as a pilot for the United Nations.
Me gusta historia. Me llamo Tomás Beck.